There's a theory that we didn't just lose a civilization. We lost the last living connection to the gods themselves. Across the world, buried beneath layers of mud and deliberately forgotten, stand buildings that should not exist. Structures so massive, so impossibly precise, that we cannot replicate them today. We're told they were built by peasants, by hand, in winters that would freeze a man solid. But what if these weren't human achievements at all? What if they were the final architectural fingerprints of beings who came here thousands of years ago, and whose last colony, a place some call Tartaria, was deliberately erased from history? Not abandoned, not forgotten, erased. And the question is, why? There is a theory that we did not just lose a civilization, but that we lost the last living connection to the gods themselves. And across the world, buried beneath layers of mud and deliberately forgotten stand buildings that should not exist, structures so massive and so impossibly precise that we cannot replicate them today. And we are told they were built by peasants, by hand, in winters that would freeze a man solid. But what if these were not human achievements at all? What if they were the final architectural fingerprints of beings who came here thousands of years ago, and whose last colony, a place some call Tartaria, was deliberately erased from history, not abandoned, not forgotten, but erased? And the question is why? Imagine for a moment that you are standing in an old European city at night, perhaps Prague or Budapest or St. Petersburg, and the streets are quiet and the air is cold, and all around you rise these enormous structures, buildings with columns thicker than ancient trees, with doorways tall enough for giants, with stonework so intricate that you could spend hours tracing a single carved detail. And you look up at these buildings and something stirs in you, something that feels almost like memory, and you wonder how they built this. You wonder who they built it for. You wonder why we do not build anything like this anymore. And if you have felt that strange wondering, then you are already closer to the truth than you know. Most of us have encountered two separate mysteries in our exploration of alternative history, and the first is the ancient astronaut theory. The idea that beings from elsewhere visited Earth in the distant past and influenced human civilization, beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. And the second mystery is more recent, the Tartarian hypothesis. The idea that a vast and technologically advanced civilization was somehow erased from history within the last few centuries. And these two mysteries seem to belong to different eras, different researchers, different rabbit holes entirely. But what if they are not two mysteries at all? What if they are the same story? What if the strange buildings we cannot explain and the ancient gods who departed are connected by a thread that runs through all of human history? Because that is what we are going to explore together. And I want to be clear from the beginning that this is not merely academic. Understanding this connection changes how you see the world. It changes how you see the buildings in your own city. It changes how you understand your own place in history. And by the time we reach the end, you will not be able to unsee what you have seen. We are going to trace a line from the departure of the gods to the buildings standing in our cities today. And to do that, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the oldest stories humanity ever told, back to a place called Sumer. When we talk about ancient civilizations, we often think of Egypt or Greece or Rome. But all of these came later. All of these inherited something from what came before, and what came before was Sumer, The civilization that emerged in Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, and Sumer, is remarkable for many reasons. But perhaps most remarkable is that the Sumerians left us written records, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped marks that we call cuneiform. And these tablets have been excavated from the ruins of cities with names like Ur and Uruk and Nippur and Eridu, cities that flourished 5,000 years ago. And when scholars finally learned to read these tablets in the 19th and 20th centuries, they discovered something extraordinary. They discovered that the Sumerians had recorded their history, their laws, their literature, their mathematics, their astronomy, and most importantly for our purposes, their mythology, their stories about where they came from and who created them and who taught them everything they knew. The Sumerian tablets tell us about beings called the Anunnaki, a name that translates roughly to those who from heaven came down or those of royal blood. And the tablets describe these beings in remarkable detail. They describe where they came from. They describe what they looked like. They describe what they did during their time on Earth. And the mainstream interpretation of these texts is that the Anunnaki were simply gods, in the way that every ancient culture had gods, metaphorical beings representing natural forces or cultural values. But there is another interpretation, an interpretation that takes the Sumerian scribes at their word, an interpretation that asks what if they were describing something real. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws heavily on earlier Sumerian sources, we read of the Anunnaki as a council of great beings who existed before humanity, who came to Earth from elsewhere, who established settlements and began operations that required labor. And when the work proved too great even for them, they created humanity to bear the burden. And this is not a metaphor buried in symbolic language. This is stated plainly. Humanity was created as a labor force, as workers for beings who needed assistance with their projects on Earth. The Atra-Hasis epic, another ancient text preserved on multiple tablets, tells the same story with additional details. It describes how the Anunnaki grew tired of their labor, how they complained and threatened rebellion, how the god Enki proposed a solution, the creation of a new being that would do the work in their place. And the tablets describe the process of this creation in terms that sound less like divine magic and more like what we might call genetic engineering, the mixing of divine essence with earthly material to produce a hybrid being, humanity. What is crucial for our purposes is to understand how the Sumerians described these beings physically, because these descriptions will become important later when we encounter them again in an unexpected context. The Anunnaki were giants. The tablets are clear about this. They towered over humanity. They were described as having tremendous stature that made ordinary humans look like children by comparison. And when you read descriptions of humans approaching the Anunnaki, the language is one of awe at their size, their presence, their physical magnificence. The Anunnaki lived for enormous spans of time, not centuries but millennia. Their lifespans were measured in what the Sumerians called sars, each sar representing 3,600 years. And while we might interpret these numbers symbolically, the texts present them matter-of-factly, as simple records of how long these beings ruled before passing authority to the next. The Anunnaki possessed technology that seemed like magic to the humans who witnessed it. They had flying craft called shems, or mo, that carried them through the skies. They had weapons of tremendous power that could level cities. They had devices that communicated across vast distances. They had the ability to generate power and light without any visible fuel source. And all of this is recorded in the tablets not as legend or fantasy, but as description, as though the scribes were simply writing down what they had seen or been told by reliable sources. The Anunnaki built structures that defied human capability, temples that rose to heaven, ziggurats of massive stone, complexes that covered vast areas, and featured engineering that the Sumerians themselves could not replicate. And when you read the inscriptions left by later Sumerian kings, you find them boasting not of building new temples, but of restoring temples built by the gods in ancient times, temples they freely admitted were beyond their own ability to create. The Anunnaki organized themselves hierarchically, with clear chains of command, councils of decision-makers, designated roles and responsibilities. And they imposed this structure on human society as well, creating priest classes who served as intermediaries, creating bloodlines of kings who claimed divine descent, creating institutions designed to maintain order and preserve knowledge across generations. And the Anunnaki taught humanity. This is perhaps the most important point of all. They did not simply rule and exploit, but they also instructed. They gave humanity writing and mathematics and astronomy and agriculture and medicine and law. They created what the Sumerians called the Me, the divine decrees or formulas that contained all the knowledge necessary for civilization. And these Me were passed down through special lineages, through mystery schools, through traditions that stretched across millennia. These are not medieval fairy tales. These are not campfire stories from illiterate tribes. These are the oldest written records humanity possesses, inscribed by scribes who believed they were recording real history, preserved in clay that has survived 5,000 years, translated by scholars using rigorous methods. And whether we interpret them literally or metaphorically, they tell us something profound about how the earliest civilizations understood their own origins. For thousands of years, according to these texts, the Anunnaki ruled. They built, they taught, and then they left, or so we are told. The Anunnaki presence in Sumerian records fades around 2000 BCE. The gods who had walked among humanity became more distant, more abstract, more like the gods of later civilizations who dwelt in heaven rather than on earth. And the tablets do not give us a single clear explanation for this change. They simply record that the age of the gods gave way to the age of kings, that humanity was left to govern itself with only memories and teachings to guide them. Various theories attempt to explain this departure. Perhaps their mission on Earth was complete, and they returned to wherever they came from. Perhaps internal conflicts among the Anunnaki themselves led to withdrawal. Perhaps some cosmic event or cycle required their departure. Perhaps they simply chose to step back and observe from a distance, and all of these theories have adherents and evidence. But for our purposes, the most important question is not why they left, but what they left behind. When a colonizing power withdraws from a territory, it does not simply vanish. Consider the British withdrawal from India in 1947. The British administrators and soldiers departed, but they left behind railways and telegraph systems. They left behind architectural styles and governmental institutions. They left behind English as a language of education and commerce. They left behind people of mixed heritage who carried British blood and British knowledge. And centuries from now, archaeologists examining India will find abundant evidence of British presence, even though the British themselves are gone. Apply this framework to the Anunnaki. Even if the gods themselves departed, their colony structures would remain. Their architecture would stand. Their technology would continue to function in the hands of those trained to use it. Their genetic legacy would persist in certain bloodlines. Their knowledge would be preserved by the institutions they established, and the question becomes not whether something remained, but what form it took and how long it lasted. Mainstream history suggests that whatever the Anunnaki represented faded completely within a few centuries of their departure, absorbed into later mythologies, diluted beyond recognition, leaving only stories and symbols. But what if this is not true? What if the colony did not simply dissolve, but continued, maintaining itself in isolation, preserving the knowledge and the technology, and perhaps even the bloodlines across millennia? What if somewhere in the world there existed a civilization that was not merely influenced by the Anunnaki, but was quite literally their last functioning outpost on Earth? This is where our story takes an unexpected turn, because there is a civilization that appeared seemingly from nowhere, that displayed exactly the characteristics we would expect from an Anunnaki remnant. A civilization that mainstream history struggles to explain. A civilization with architecture too advanced for its supposed era, with technology that should not have existed, with inhabitants who some accounts describe as physically remarkable, with a sudden and suspicious disappearance from the historical record. And this civilization appears on old maps covering vast territories. It appears in old encyclopedias as a real place with real inhabitants. It appears in historical accounts as a major power. And then, somehow it vanishes. Somehow it gets erased. Somehow it becomes something we are not supposed to remember. And they called it Tartaria. Before we explore Tartaria itself, let us establish clearly the identification markers we should look for, the characteristics that would indicate Anunnaki origin or influence. Because if Tartaria was truly the last Anunnaki colony, we would expect to find these markers present. First, gigantic stature. The Anunnaki were described as enormous compared to humans, and any remnant colony might be expected to include individuals of unusual size, whether pure Anunnaki who remained behind, hybrid descendants carrying the giant genetics, or simply architecture scaled for beings larger than ordinary humans. Second, advanced architectural knowledge. Structures that defied the engineering capabilities attributed to their builders. Buildings that should not exist, given the tools and techniques supposedly available. Construction that implies knowledge beyond what the official historical record allows. Third, energy technology. Evidence of power generation that required no visible fuel source. Buildings that seemed designed to collect or distribute energy. Devices or systems that operated through principles we do not fully understand. Fourth, longevity. Evidence of extended lifespans among certain populations or bloodlines. Records of individuals living far beyond normal human spans. Institutions designed to preserve knowledge across centuries or millennia. Fifth, hierarchical structure, organized civilization with clear chains of command, priest classes or mystery schools serving as knowledge custodians, bloodlines claiming special status or divine descent. Sixth, teaching function, emphasis on passing knowledge to future generations, creation of educational institutions or initiatic traditions, preservation of wisdom that originated from elsewhere or before. These 6 markers will guide us through the evidence ahead, and as we examine Tartaria together, I invite you to watch for them, to notice when they appear, to feel the pattern emerging. Because once you see the connections, you cannot unsee them. And once you understand what we may have lost, you cannot help but mourn it. If you pull up old maps from the 16th and 17th centuries, maps drawn by European cartographers who were supposedly documenting the known world, you will find something strange, something that most history classes skip right over. And that something is a name that sprawls across vast territories, stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. A name written in elegant script that reads Tartaria, or sometimes Grande Tartari. And when you look at these maps, you notice that Tartaria is not depicted as some vague unknown region filled with question marks and sea monsters. It is shown with borders and cities and details, suggesting that whoever made these maps believed they were documenting a real place, a real civilization. And yet, when you open a modern history textbook and search for Tartaria, you find almost nothing. Maybe a footnote explaining that Europeans used this term loosely to describe the unfamiliar peoples of Central Asia. Maybe a dismissive sentence about how it was never a real unified empire, just a catch-all label for everything east of Russia that Europeans did not understand. And that explanation might satisfy most people, but if you have been paying attention to what we discussed about the Anunnaki, about their characteristics and their technology, and the mystery of what they left behind when they departed, then this dismissal should feel inadequate. It should feel suspicious. Because the more you look into what researchers have uncovered about the civilization that may have existed under that name, the more you start to recognize patterns we have seen before. The core mysteries that surround Tartaria are not vague rumors or wishful thinking. They are documented anomalies that mainstream historians struggle to explain. And these anomalies fall into several categories that we need to examine carefully, starting with architecture that should not exist given the official timeline. Buildings of such massive scale and such precise construction that our modern equipment would struggle to replicate them. These structures that appeared seemingly overnight, according to official records in cities across Europe, Asia, and North America, courthouses and civic buildings and train stations and World Fair pavilions that we are told were built by hand in a matter of months by workers using primitive tools. And when you actually look at these buildings, when you stand before them or study photographs from the 1800s, you feel something that is hard to put into words, a sense that you are being lied to, that no amount of determination and horse-drawn wagons could produce structures this precise and this massive in the time frames we are given. Then there are the buried first floors, the windows at ground level that clearly were not designed to be at ground level, the doorways that now require steps down into them when they obviously were built to be entered at street height. And when you notice this pattern in one city, you might dismiss it. But when you notice it in city after city across multiple continents, when you see the same evidence of burial in St. Petersburg and in Chicago and in Melbourne and in San Francisco, you have to ask yourself, what happened? What event could have buried the first floors of buildings across the entire Northern Hemisphere? And why does no one talk about it? And then there are the doorways themselves, entrances so enormous that they dwarf the humans photographed standing beside them in old images, doors that would be 12 or 15 feet tall, scaled for beings much larger than any modern human. And when you ask why anyone would build doors that size, the official answer is always something about grandeur or intimidation or aesthetic preference. But when you remember what the Sumerian texts told us about the Anunnaki, about their stature, about their physical presence that towered over ordinary humans, suddenly these massive doorways make a different kind of sense. The question we need to ask is not simply whether Tartaria existed as a distinct civilization, because that question has been debated endlessly without resolution. The real question, the one that changes everything if we answer it honestly, is whether Tartaria was the last Anunnaki colony on Earth. Whether the buildings we see with their impossible scale and their buried floors and their giant doorways are not human achievements at all, but the inherited architecture of beings who came from somewhere else. And to answer that question, we need to look at the evidence point by point and compare it to what the Sumerians told us about the gods themselves. When the Anunnaki built, according to every text that survives from ancient Sumer, they built on a scale that left humans breathless. Temples that touched the heavens, ziggurats that required generations to complete, structures so precise in their alignment and their proportion that even the most skilled human craftsman could only marvel at the perfection. And when you read these descriptions and then look at the buildings attributed to Tartaria, buildings that mainstream history tells us were constructed by 19th century workers in impossible timeframes, the similarity is unsettling. You see the same massive scale, the same precise symmetry, the same attention to proportion and alignment, the same use of materials that seem almost too perfect for their stated time period. Granite facades polished to a mirror finish, columns carved from single blocks of stone weighing tons, ornamental details at heights where no human observer could appreciate them unless they were designed for observers who stood much taller than we do or who could view them from above. Consider the specific architectural features that appear again and again in buildings identified as Tartarian. The enormous arched windows, the domed rooftops, the colonnades of massive pillars, the intricate stonework that would take modern craftsmen months to complete by hand. And then consider that we are told these buildings were erected in months, not years, by workers without power tools, often in the middle of harsh winters when outdoor construction would be nearly impossible. And the official explanation is always some variation of they were just really skilled and really motivated. But when you look at a building like the original Grand Central Depot, or the Palace of Fine Arts, or any of the magnificent structures from the Chicago World's Fair, structures we are told were temporary exhibition halls thrown together in 18 months, you realize that the official explanation asks us to believe something that borders on the miraculous, or perhaps crosses that border entirely. The Sumerian texts describe how the Anunnaki used technologies that seemed like magic to human observers, machines that could lift massive stones, tools that could cut through rock like water, building techniques that allowed precision impossible to achieve by human hands alone. And when the Anunnaki departed, they did not take all of this knowledge with them. Some of it remained, passed down through the humans and hybrids who stayed behind, maintained in the colonies that continued to function after the gods were gone. And if Tartaria was such a colony, if it inherited this building technology and this architectural knowledge, then suddenly the impossible construction timelines make sense. Not because 19th century workers were superhuman, but because the buildings were not built by 19th century workers at all. They were built using methods and tools that we no longer possess, methods and tools that we have been systematically prevented from remembering. Look at old photographs from San Francisco before the fire of 1906. Photographs showing ornate buildings of massive scale lining streets that had supposedly been wilderness just 50 years earlier. Look at photographs from Melbourne in the 1880s, showing civic structures that would challenge modern construction companies. Look at photographs from St. Petersburg showing palaces rising from what we are told was frozen swampland, and ask yourself whether the official story makes sense, whether any amount of human determination and primitive tools could produce what you're seeing, or whether something else was at work, something connected to a lineage of knowledge that stretches back to the beings who first taught humans how to build. The acoustic properties of certain buildings identified as Tartarian offer another point of connection to what we know about the Anunnaki, because these buildings are not simply large and ornate, they are resonant in ways that suggest deliberate design, domed chambers that amplify sound in specific frequencies, hallways that carry whispers across impossible distances, spaces that seem to affect human consciousness in ways that are difficult to measure but easy to feel. And when you stand in one of these old courthouses or these abandoned train stations and you speak aloud and you hear your voice transformed by the architecture around you, you understand that whoever built these spaces understood something about sound and frequency that we have mostly forgotten. The Sumerians described how the Anunnaki used sound as a tool, frequencies that could heal or harm, vibrations that could move objects or alter states of consciousness, sonic technologies that seemed miraculous to human observers. And while we cannot prove that Tartarian buildings incorporated this knowledge into their design, the evidence suggests at least the possibility. The resonant chambers, the specific proportions that appear again and again, the acoustic effects that modern engineers struggle to explain or replicate. All of this points toward builders who understood principles that mainstream science dismisses or ignores. The worldwide similarity of Tartarian architecture presents another puzzle that mainstream explanations fail to resolve. Because when you compare buildings from Russia and buildings from America and buildings from Australia, structures built on opposite sides of the planet by people who supposedly had no contact with each other, you find the same stylistic elements appearing again and again, the same arched windows, the same columned facades, the same domed rooftops, the same proportions and the same materials and the same impossible scale. And the official explanation is that this represents an architectural trend, a fashion that spread around the world through normal channels of communication. But when you examine how quickly this style appeared and how consistently it was executed across cultures that had radically different building traditions, the trend explanation starts to feel insufficient. It starts to feel like an excuse designed to prevent us from asking harder questions. What if the buildings look the same because they came from the same source, not a shared fashion, but a shared inheritance? Not an architectural trend, but an architectural lineage that stretches back to builders who were not human at all. What if the reason you see the same style in St. Petersburg and San Francisco and Sydney is because all of these cities were once part of the same network, the same civilization, the same colony of beings who inherited their knowledge from the gods themselves? And what if the reason we are not supposed to ask these questions is because the answers would change everything we think we know about our past? The architecture tells us something important, but buildings are just shells. They are containers, and to understand a civilization, you need to understand not just what it built, but how it functioned. And this brings us to perhaps the most controversial aspect of Tartarian research: the question of energy. The theory that these buildings were not merely structures, but machines, not simply places to live and work, but systems designed to collect and distribute power in ways we no longer understand. When researchers began examining old photographs of Tartarian buildings, they noticed something strange: architectural elements that served no obvious decorative purpose, protrusions and antennae and metal fixtures that appeared on rooftops and spires, but that have since been removed. And when they looked at the buildings as they exist today, renovated and restored over the past century, they found that these elements were systematically eliminated, stripped away during repairs and never replaced, as if someone had decided that these particular features needed to disappear. And the question that emerged from this observation was simple but profound. What were these elements for, and why were they removed? The free energy theory associated with Tartarian research proposes that these buildings were designed to harvest energy directly from the atmosphere, from the electromagnetic field of the Earth itself, and that the architectural elements we see in old photographs, the antennae and the copper fixtures and the ornamental spires, were actually functional components of this energy system. Not decoration, but technology, not aesthetics, but engineering. And while this theory might sound outlandish at first, it becomes less so when you consider what we know about the Anunnaki and their technological capabilities. The Sumerian texts describe devices called shems, objects that are often interpreted as flying craft, but that some researchers believe may have been energy devices, sources of power that required no visible fuel, and that produced effects that seemed miraculous to human observers. And the texts also describe temples that glowed with light that had no apparent source, buildings that maintained warmth without fire and illumination without flame. And while we cannot know exactly what technology produced these effects, we know that the Anunnaki possessed capabilities far beyond what humans of that era could achieve or understand. If Tartaria was an Anunnaki colony, if it inherited not just architectural knowledge, but energy technology as well, then the buildings we see might represent the remnants of this inheritance. Structures designed to tap into the same principles that powered the temples of the gods. Energy systems that functioned for centuries, or perhaps millennia, until they were deliberately disabled by those who came after. And the removal of the architectural elements we see in old photographs might represent not renovation, but sabotage, not restoration, but destruction. The systematic dismantling of technology that threatened whoever now controls the narrative of our past. Consider Nikola Tesla, the genius who claimed to have developed wireless energy transmission in the early 20th century. Technology that would have allowed power to be distributed across distances without wires, and consider how his work was suppressed, his funding cut, his laboratory destroyed, his legacy minimized in mainstream historical accounts, and consider how many other researchers into free energy have met similar fates: funding withdrawn, reputations destroyed, mysterious deaths that were ruled accidents or suicides, and you begin to see a pattern, a systematic suppression of energy technology that stretches across centuries, as if someone or something has been determined to ensure that humanity never rediscovers what the Anunnaki knew, what Tartaria may have preserved, what could change everything about how we live and how we understand our world. Look at old photographs of buildings before they were renovated, and you will see the elements that have been removed, the metal fixtures on domed rooftops, the ornamental protrusions that served no obvious aesthetic purpose, the spires topped with objects that look less like decoration and more like antenna. And then look at those same buildings today and notice what is missing, and ask yourself why these elements were removed, why no one preserved them or studied them, why the official record contains no explanation for why buildings that supposedly required these elements for their original design no longer have them. And if you follow this question far enough, you will arrive at a possibility that changes everything. The possibility that these buildings were machines, energy systems designed by beings who understood principles we have been prevented from rediscovering, technology that was inherited from the Anunnaki and maintained by their colony for as long as that colony survived. Some researchers have focused on what they call organ pipe elements, vertical protrusions that appear on certain buildings, and that bear a striking resemblance to the pipes of a pipe organ. And they propose that these elements functioned as resonant chambers, harvesting specific frequencies from the atmosphere and converting them into usable energy. And while we cannot verify this theory without access to the original structures and their original configurations, the proposal is at least consistent with what we know about frequency and resonance and the relationship between sound and energy. And it is consistent with what the Sumerian texts tell us about the Anunnaki's mastery of these principles. If you have been following along, if you have allowed yourself to see the patterns that emerge when you compare Tartarian characteristics to Anunnaki attributes, then you are already feeling something shift in your understanding, a sense that pieces are falling into place, that connections are forming, that mainstream history has worked very hard to prevent. And what we have established so far is significant but incomplete. We have seen that Tartarian architecture matches descriptions of Anunnaki building, massive scale, precise construction, impossible timelines, designs scaled for beings larger than modern humans. We have seen that Tartarian energy systems, or at least the remnants of what might have been energy systems, match descriptions of Anunnaki technology, power without visible fuel, devices that harvested energy from sources we no longer understand, knowledge that has been systematically suppressed, and these connections take us a long way toward answering our central question. But they do not take us all the way. Because if Tataria was truly an Anunnaki colony, if it inherited not just technology, but lineage, then we would expect to find one more category of evidence, the evidence that the beings who lived in these buildings and operated this technology were themselves different from ordinary humans, larger, longer-lived, possessed of capabilities that set them apart. And when we turn our attention to this evidence, when we ask what happened to the giants themselves, the picture that emerges is both wondrous and tragic, a story of golden age and catastrophic loss. And that story is where we must now go. When we return to those ancient Sumerian tablets and read carefully what the scribes recorded about the Anunnaki themselves, we find descriptions that should give us pause, because these beings were not described as ordinary in any sense of the word, and certainly not in their physical form. The Sumerians called them those who from heaven came, And when they described encounters between humans and these celestial visitors, the difference in scale was always emphasized. The Anunnaki towered over humanity. They were giants in the most literal sense, beings whose physical stature matched their cosmic origin. And when we understand this detail, everything about Tartaria begins to make a different kind of sense. Consider for a moment the architectural anomalies we discussed earlier. Those massive doorways that seem absurdly oversized for any practical human use. The ceilings that soar to heights that would make heating impossible in cold climates if they were designed for people of normal stature. The furniture that appears in old photographs looking almost comically large. We have been told that these were simply stylistic choices, that architects of previous centuries simply preferred grandeur for its own sake. But this explanation asks us to believe that people who struggled through harsh winters without central heating chose to build cavernous rooms that could never be adequately warmed. It asks us to believe that people who climbed stairs without elevators preferred staircases with treads designed for legs far longer than their own. It asks us to believe that the most impractical design choices imaginable were made consistently across continents and centuries by unconnected builders who all shared the same bizarre aesthetic preferences. Or we could consider another possibility. These structures were built for their actual inhabitants, and those inhabitants were not entirely human. The evidence for giants walking the earth in relatively recent history is more substantial than most people realize, primarily because that evidence has been systematically hidden from public view. Throughout the 19th century, newspapers across North America and Europe regularly reported the discovery of enormous human skeletons, bones that belonged to individuals standing 7, 8, 9 feet tall and sometimes considerably more. These were not tabloid stories, but matter-of-fact reports in respectable publications, accounts of farmers uncovering massive remains while ploughing fields, of construction workers finding burial sites containing skeletons that dwarfed anything in the normal human range, and of archaeological excavations that turned up evidence of a larger species of humanity existing alongside or perhaps ruling over ordinary humans. These reports appeared consistently for decades, and then they stopped. Not because the discoveries stopped, but because the discoveries began disappearing. The allegations surrounding the Smithsonian Institution deserve particular attention here because they point to a pattern of active suppression rather than mere neglect. Researchers who have investigated this matter describe a consistent sequence of events that played out across multiple sites. Large skeletal remains would be discovered and reported. Representatives from established institutions would arrive to collect the bones for study. The remains would disappear into private collections or institutional storage. No papers would be published, no exhibitions would be mounted. And when later researchers attempted to locate these specimens, they would be told that no records existed, that the bones must have been misidentified, that the whole matter was the result of confusion or exaggeration. This happened not once, but dozens of times across more than a century. The bones existed, the reports existed, and then somehow neither existed in any form that could be studied or verified. We might ask why anyone would go to such lengths to suppress evidence of unusual human stature, and the answer becomes clear when we consider what that evidence would imply. If giant humans existed in recent history, if they lived alongside ordinary people, If they built structures scaled to their own dimensions, then we must ask where they came from. The mainstream framework has no space for such beings, but the ancient texts do. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki creating humanity through genetic manipulation, essentially engineering our species to serve their purposes. The tablets describe this process in remarkable detail, speaking of the mixing of clay, which many researchers interpret as biological material, with the essence of a god to produce a new creature. If the Anunnaki possessed this capability, then they also possessed the capability to create intermediate forms, hybrid beings that combined Anunnaki and human characteristics. And here we find the key to understanding Tartaria's population, because a colony left behind after the main Anunnaki presence departed would not have been staffed by pure Anunnaki alone. It would have included hybrids, beings who carried the genetic inheritance of the gods in varying degrees, some nearly human, and others closer to their celestial ancestors. This concept appears across virtually every ancient culture on Earth, under different names, but with consistent characteristics. The Greeks called them demigods, the offspring of unions between gods and mortals. The Hebrew scriptures speak of the Nephilim, the giants who walked the earth when the sons of God took the daughters of men as wives. The Norse traditions describe beings of supernatural stature who existed before the current age of the world. The Hindu texts speak of races of beings who preceded modern humanity, some of enormous size, who possessed knowledge and abilities beyond normal human capacity. We are told these are all mythology, products of primitive imagination. But the consistency of these accounts across cultures that had no contact with each other suggests a different origin. They are memories, stories passed down through countless generations, preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down, describing a real phenomenon that existed in the distant and perhaps not so distant past. In Tartaria, this hybrid population would have maintained the knowledge and technology inherited from their Anunnaki ancestors. They would have understood the buildings because they were designed for beings like themselves. They would have operated the energy systems because they inherited the understanding of how those systems worked. They would have served as intermediaries between the departed gods and ordinary humanity, preserving the connection even in the absence of the gods themselves. And some of them may have survived longer than we imagine, persisting into historical periods that we think of as purely human, their presence documented in old photographs showing individuals of unusual height among populations of normal stature, in furniture and architecture scaled for bodies larger than ours, in stories and legends that speak of tall kings and giant warriors who ruled before the current age. These beings were not just physically impressive. They were custodians of something far more valuable than stature alone. They were the knowledge keepers, the inheritors of Anunnaki wisdom, and to understand Tartaria, we must understand what they knew. Imagine for a moment a civilization that operated with a completely different understanding of fundamental reality, not the primitive understanding we attribute to past ages, but knowledge that makes our own science look incomplete. The Tartarian civilization, if it existed as we have been describing it, would have possessed what we might call Anunnaki science, an understanding of energy and matter and consciousness that we have either lost or been prevented from rediscovering. This knowledge would have included the free energy technology we discussed earlier, the ability to draw power from the atmosphere itself, from the earth, from sources that required no mining, no combustion, no infrastructure of extraction and pollution. The buildings themselves served as energy collectors, resonating with frequencies we have forgotten how to measure, channeling power through architectural forms that we now dismiss as merely decorative. But energy was only one aspect of what they knew. Consider the medical knowledge that would have existed in such a civilization. Healing practices that worked with the body's own energies rather than against them. Understanding of plants and minerals and frequencies that could restore health without the brutal interventions we consider normal today. Consider the agricultural knowledge, methods of working with the land that enhanced fertility rather than depleting it, techniques for growing food in abundance without the poisoning of soil and water that modern farming requires. Consider their astronomical knowledge, the precise understanding of celestial cycles that appears in calendars and monuments, attributed to peoples who supposedly lacked sophisticated instruments. The awareness of cosmic rhythms and their effects on earthly life. Consider the psychological knowledge, techniques for developing human potential that we would call supernatural, methods for expanding consciousness, for accessing states of awareness that modern people can barely imagine. All of this would have been preserved and transmitted through structured systems of knowledge transfer, what we might recognize as mystery schools or initiatic traditions. These were not merely philosophical clubs, but functioning educational institutions where the inherited wisdom of the Anunnaki was passed from one generation to the next through careful training and gradual revelation. The candidate would progress through levels of understanding, each stage building on the last, until the full scope of Tartarian knowledge was achieved. Some lineages focused on specific disciplines, preserving particular branches of the ancient wisdom. Others maintained the broader framework, the understanding of how all the pieces fit together into a coherent model of reality. This system worked for thousands of years, maintaining the connection to Anunnaki knowledge long after the gods themselves had departed. But knowledge of this value cannot exist without attracting the attention of those who wish to control it or destroy it. We see throughout history the pattern of libraries burned, of teaching lineages suppressed, of books banned and knowledge holders executed. Alexandria's great library, containing perhaps the largest collection of ancient wisdom ever assembled in one place, was destroyed multiple times before its final dissolution. The indigenous knowledge systems of the Americas and Africa and Australia were systematically attacked by colonizing powers who may not have fully understood what they were destroying, but who served the purposes of those who did understand. The mystery schools of Europe were driven underground, their teachings fragmented and scattered, their lineages broken. We are told these destructions were accidental or motivated by religious intolerance, or simply the collateral damage of conquest and conflict. But the pattern is too consistent, too complete, too focused on specific types of knowledge to be explained by chance. Someone, or some group, has been working for centuries to ensure that the Anunnaki inheritance is erased from human memory. And the destruction of Tartaria itself may have been the culmination of this project, with the final elimination of the last civilization that still possessed and practiced the ancient knowledge. Let us pause here and attempt something that may seem impossible but feels necessary. Let us try to imagine what it would have been like to live in Tartaria during its golden age, before the catastrophe, before the erasure, when the civilization we have been discussing still functioned as it was designed to function. Imagine waking in a city unlike any you have known, in a room that is comfortable despite the winter cold outside, because the building itself maintains a steady warmth through principles you might not understand, but whose effects you experience every moment. There is no furnace, no radiator, no visible source of heat. The walls themselves seem to breathe with gentle energy, the architecture designed to capture and distribute ambient power in ways that make the concept of fuel seem primitive and unnecessary. Light fills the space, not harsh electric glare, but something softer, more natural, emanating from fixtures that require no wires, no bulbs, no external power source. The room is large by our standards, but proportioned correctly for its inhabitants, some of whom would tower over any modern human, while others approximate what we would consider normal height. The furniture is solid, built to support bodies of various sizes, crafted with materials and techniques that would last for generations. Through windows of clearer glass than our modern factories typically produce, you see the city spread beneath you, a cityscape dominated by buildings that combine impossible scale with impossible grace. Spires reach toward the sky, domes catch the morning light, facades display ornamental details that serve purposes beyond mere decoration. The streets are wide and clean, designed for a flow of movement that includes beings of different sizes, walking in apparent harmony, vehicles that move silently through channels that seem almost organic in their integration with the urban fabric. There is no smog, no smoke, no visible pollution of any kind, because the energy that powers this civilization produces no waste, requires no combustion, leaves no residue. The air itself feels different, charged with something subtle, carrying frequencies that lift rather than drain the human spirit. You eat food that was grown in ways we would not recognize, using techniques that enhanced rather than depleted the soil, it producing nutrition of a quality that our industrial agriculture cannot match. You drink water that was never poisoned, that flows through systems designed to maintain its natural vitality rather than strip it away. Illness exists, but is rare, addressed by healers who understand the body as an energy system that can be brought back into balance through methods that seem miraculous to modern eyes, but were simply science to those who practiced them. You have access to information that spans millennia, preserved in archives and taught in schools, a continuous tradition stretching back to the time when the gods themselves walked among humanity. You know your history, your real history, because it was never hidden from you, never replaced with false narratives, never erased from memory. You know where your civilization came from, what your ancestors learned from their teachers among the stars, what responsibilities and possibilities this inheritance carries. The temples still stand in this world, vast structures whose acoustic properties were designed for specific purposes, where ceremonies maintain the connection to energies and presences that ordinary modern consciousness cannot perceive. Perhaps you cannot feel the gods directly anymore. Perhaps the full communion that existed in earlier ages has faded, but the link remains, maintained through ritual and architecture and the bloodlines that carry Anunnaki genetics into each new generation. This is not utopia in the naive sense. There is still conflict, still suffering, still the limitations that come with physical existence. But the baseline of life, the foundation on which everything else rests, is so different from what we know that it almost defies comparison. The scarcity we accept as normal does not exist because the energy is unlimited. The disease we fear is manageable because the knowledge exists to address it. The existential loneliness we feel, the sense of being abandoned in an indifferent cosmos, is absent because the connection to something larger has never been severed. This is what we may have lost. Not just buildings, not just technology, not just knowledge, but an entire way of existing in the world, a relationship with reality itself that was our inheritance as children of the Anunnaki experiment, and that was taken from us through catastrophe and suppression and deliberate forgetting. For perhaps thousands of years this civilization existed, this last remnant of the gods themselves walking among humanity, the maintaining the knowledge and the technology and the connection across generations that forgot how much time had passed since the original departure. The hybrid bloodlines continued their work. The initiatic schools continued their teaching. The energy systems continued their silent operation. The buildings continued to resonate with frequencies that kept the whole system functioning. It was not immortal. Nothing physical is immortal. But it was stable in a way that made it seem permanent, so deeply rooted that its inhabitants could not imagine its ending. They were wrong. We know they were wrong because we live in the aftermath of Tartaria's fall, surrounded by the remnants of something that once was whole, inheriting a fragment of what should have been our birthright. The Golden Age ended. The question that haunts everything that follows is how and why and at whose hands. Because the more we examine the evidence, the more certain it becomes that what happened to Tartaria was not accident, was not natural disaster, was not the ordinary decline that comes to all civilizations eventually. Something was done, something deliberate, something designed not merely to end a civilization, but to erase it so completely that future generations would not know it had ever existed, would not know what they had lost, would not know to mourn or to question or to seek what was taken from them. We live in that designed ignorance. We inherit that deliberate forgetting. And as we move forward in our exploration, we must confront the darkest chapter of this story, of the extinction event that ended the Golden Age and the systematic erasure that followed, erasing not just Tartaria, but the last physical proof that the Anunnaki were ever here at all. And then it ended, not with the slow fade of a civilization growing tired and old, not with the gradual forgetting that comes when one generation fails to teach the next, but with something else entirely, something sudden and catastrophic and deliberate, something that buried an entire world beneath layers of mud and silence and manufactured amnesia. And when we look at the evidence of this ending, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a grief so vast it becomes difficult to breathe. Because what was taken from us was not just buildings and knowledge and technology, but our last living connection to something greater than ourselves. Our final thread to the beings who made us, and the proof of this catastrophe, is not hidden in obscure texts or contested artifacts, but stands in plain sight in cities across the Northern Hemisphere, where buildings that should rise proudly from the earth instead sink into it, their first floors buried beneath street level, their grand entrance doors now opening onto dirt and darkness, their basement windows sitting at ground level in a way that makes no architectural sense unless you understand that something pushed the ground up around them, something deposited layer after layer of mud and debris, until what was once a first floor became a basement, and what was once a basement became a subterranean tomb. And you can see this yourself if you know where to look. In the old cities of Europe, where ornate facades disappear into the sidewalk. In American cities where century-old photographs show workers excavating buildings that were supposedly just constructed, digging them out of the earth as if they had always been there waiting to be found, rather than freshly built by the hands that claimed credit for them and the mainstream explanations for this phenomenon. Strain credulity to its breaking point. We are told that cities simply accumulated debris over time, that streets were deliberately raised for drainage or sanitation, that construction records were simply lost or poorly kept. But none of these explanations account for the sheer scale of what we observe. None of them explain why this phenomenon appears simultaneously across continents. None of them address the fundamental question of how entire first floors of massive stone buildings could be buried in what official history claims was a period of unprecedented record-keeping and documentation. And when we examine the evidence with fresh eyes, we begin to see the outline of something far more disturbing. Not gradual accumulation, but sudden deposition. Not rising streets, but falling debris. Not poor record-keeping, but deliberate erasure. And the scope of this event becomes almost too large to comprehend when we realize that cities from St. Petersburg to San Francisco show the same telltale signs, the same buried floors, the same excavated entrances, the same architectural features that make no sense unless something catastrophic happened to bury them. And catastrophe is precisely what we are looking at. An event so massive that it deposited meters of material across the entire northern hemisphere. An event so total that it buried not just buildings, but the civilization that created them. An event so complete that almost no record of it survives in official history, and that absence of records is itself evidence of something deeply wrong. Because natural disasters leave traces in the historical record. They leave refugee accounts and reconstruction narratives and cultural trauma that echoes through generations. The great fires of London and Chicago and San Francisco live on in collective memory precisely because they were natural events that could not be hidden. But the mud flood left no such record, or rather, the records it left have been systematically suppressed, hidden, destroyed, rewritten until what should be the defining catastrophe of recent centuries became a mystery that most people have never heard of. And this suppression points to something far more disturbing than natural disaster. It points to deliberate action, coordinated erasure, a war waged not with weapons, but with silence and misdirection, and the patient rewriting of everything humanity thought it knew about its own past, because a natural disaster, however massive, might be forgotten over centuries. But this forgetting was too complete, too systematic. This was not the natural fading of memory, but the active destruction of it. This was not forgetting, this was erasure. And when we begin to examine the mechanisms of this erasure, we find ourselves confronting a pattern of suppression so thorough and so coordinated that it challenges our most basic assumptions about how history works and who controls the stories we are told. Because what we call history is not a neutral recording of events, but a narrative constructed and maintained by institutions with their own interests and agendas. And the institutions that control our understanding of the past have demonstrated repeatedly that they will suppress, distort, or simply ignore evidence that contradicts the official story. And we see this pattern everywhere once we know what to look for in the orphan trains that transported hundreds of thousands of children across America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Children who supposedly came from the slums of eastern cities, but whose origins remain suspiciously undocumented. Children who arrived in numbers that strain any explanation involving normal urban poverty. Children who some researchers believe were the survivors of a destroyed civilization, the scattered remnants of Tartarian communities whose parents and families had been eliminated in the catastrophe. And we see this pattern in the photographs of cities that should have been bustling with construction workers and new inhabitants, but instead appear strangely empty, their magnificent buildings standing in what looks like abandonment, as if the photographers were documenting not new construction, but rediscovery, not creation, but excavation. And we see this pattern in the missing census records and the gaps in municipal archives and the convenient fires that destroyed documentation in city after city, just as researchers began asking uncomfortable questions. And we see this pattern in the role of major institutions like the Smithsonian, which has been accused repeatedly of suppressing archaeological evidence that contradicts official timelines, acquiring artifacts and specimens that are never seen again, funding expeditions whose discoveries somehow never reach public awareness, maintaining a gatekeeping function that ensures only approved narratives reach the mainstream. And we see this pattern in the academic establishment itself, where careers are destroyed and funding is withdrawn from researchers who ask the wrong questions, where peer review becomes a mechanism not for ensuring quality, but for enforcing orthodoxy, where the boundaries of acceptable inquiry are policed with a vigilance that would be unnecessary if the official story were actually true. And when we step back and view this pattern in its totality, we begin to see the outline of something that can only be called a war on memory, a coordinated campaign not just to destroy Tartaria, but to ensure that no one would ever know it had existed, to sever humanity not just from its past, but from the knowledge that it had a past worth remembering. And this campaign extended beyond mere suppression of evidence to the active restructuring of how we understand time itself, because some researchers have proposed that our accepted timeline has been deliberately manipulated, that events we believe happened centuries or millennia ago actually occurred much more recently, that the calendar itself has been stretched and distorted to create distance between us and a past that threatens the current order. And while this phantom time hypothesis remains controversial even among alternative researchers, it points to a deeper truth about the malleability of historical narrative and the willingness of those in power to manipulate our most basic frameworks of understanding, and we see echoes of this willingness in every library. Burning, in every book banning, in every persecution of teaching traditions that preserved knowledge outside official channels, in the systematic destruction of indigenous knowledge systems that might have remembered what the controllers wanted forgotten, in the suppression of oral traditions and family histories and folk memories that contradicted the neat narratives of approved textbooks. And the scope of this suppression becomes even more disturbing when we consider the star forts, those geometric fortifications found on every continent, whose official histories cannot adequately explain their origin or purpose, because many of these forts show evidence of destruction not from ground assault, but from above, their walls melted and vitrified in ways that suggest energy weapons rather than conventional artillery. Their interiors charred in patterns that point to fire raining down from the sky. And when we combine this evidence with the mudflood deposits and the empty cities and the orphan trains and the suppressed records, a picture begins to emerge of coordinated destruction followed by equally coordinated forgetting, of a civilization that was not merely defeated but erased, its buildings buried, its people scattered, its very existence scrubbed from the historical record by forces who understood that the greatest weapon against truth is not argument, but silence. And yet, despite the thoroughness of this campaign, despite the layers of mud and lies and institutional forgetting, something survived, because you cannot erase everything. You cannot suppress truth forever, and the evidence of what was lost remains visible to those who know how to see it, hidden in plain sight, in the buildings that still stand, in the traditions that still remember, in the bloodlines that still carry the genetic inheritance of a destroyed civilization, in the symbols that still appear across cultures in ways that official history cannot explain. And the buildings themselves are our most obvious witnesses, structures that still defy explanation, that still contain architectural details and engineering achievements that contradict everything we are told about the capabilities of their supposed builders. Buildings whose ornate facades extend below street level, whose proportions suggest inhabitants larger than modern humans, whose acoustic properties and geometric relationships hint at purposes far beyond mere shelter or commerce. And these buildings stand in cities around the world as silent testimony to something that mainstream history refuses to acknowledge, something that the war on memory was designed to make us forget. And, alongside these physical witnesses, the esoteric traditions have preserved fragments of the lost knowledge passed down through mystery schools and initiatic orders and family lineages that maintained their teachings despite persecution and suppression. And while these traditions have been fragmented and diluted over generations, while much of what they preserve has been mixed with later additions and misunderstandings, they still contain threads that can be traced back to older and stranger sources, to teachings that predate the catastrophe, to knowledge that was deemed too dangerous to destroy completely, but too important to forget entirely. And the genetic evidence, too, has survived the erasure in bloodlines that show unusual characteristics, in families whose documented stature or longevity or other traits point to ancestry that is not entirely ordinary, in the persistent legends of royal and aristocratic lines claiming descent from beings greater than human, and the symbolic evidence persists as well, in emblems and icons that appear across cultures separated by oceans and centuries, in architectural motifs that recur worldwide in ways that independent development cannot explain, in mythological themes that tell the same stories with different names, all pointing back to a common source that official history denies ever existed. And when we gather all this surviving evidence together, we realize that the suppression, however thorough, could never be complete, that the war on memory was always destined to fail, because truth has a persistence that lies can never quite match, that the very thoroughness of the erasure points to the importance of what was erased, because you do not expend such effort to hide something unimportant. You do not coordinate across continents and centuries to suppress something that does not matter. And so we find ourselves at a strange crossroads in this story, having witnessed the golden age of the last Anunnaki colony, having seen the evidence of its catastrophic destruction, having documented the systematic erasure that followed, we now face the question that brings all of this into the present moment. Because the buildings still stand, the traditions still remember, the bloodlines still carry what could not be destroyed. And if the evidence has survived this long despite everything that was done to eliminate it, if fragments of truth still persist, despite the most comprehensive suppression campaign in human history, then perhaps we are not too late. Perhaps awareness itself is a form of recovery. Perhaps the simple act of seeing what we were meant to forget constitutes a victory over those who tried to sever us from our own past. And so the question becomes not merely what happened. That question we have now answered as fully as surviving evidence allows. But what does this mean for us today? What responsibility comes with this knowledge? And what can we do to ensure that what was almost lost is not lost completely? That the last colony of the gods is remembered? That the beings who made us are not forgotten? That the thread connecting humanity to its cosmic origins, damaged though it may be, is never finally severed? And so we arrive at the present day, at the world we inhabit now, at the cities we walk through without truly seeing. And we must ask ourselves a difficult question, a question that implicates us all. Because the erasure we have been documenting, the systematic suppression of Tartaria, and the final severance of humanity from its Anunnaki origins, this is not something that happened long ago and ended. This is something that continues, something that operates in our world right now, something that many of us participate in without ever realizing what we are doing. Consider what happens to old buildings in our cities today, not the famous landmarks that are protected by preservation societies and tourist dollars, but the countless other structures, the old post offices and train stations and civic buildings that were constructed in that unmistakable style we have been examining throughout this journey. Buildings with columns that serve no structural purpose according to modern engineering. Buildings with ornate details at heights where no human eye would naturally look. Buildings with basements that were clearly once ground floors. Buildings that radiate a strange gravity that modern architecture simply cannot replicate. These buildings are disappearing systematically, methodically, replaced by glass towers and concrete boxes that will not stand for a century, let alone a millennium. In city after city, the pattern repeats. A historic building is declared structurally unsound or economically unviable. The local preservation society fights a losing battle. And then, one morning, the wrecking ball arrives, and another piece of evidence is reduced to rubble, carted away, buried in a landfill where no one will ever examine the strange metals in its frame, or the acoustic properties of its stones, or the energy signatures that certain instruments can still detect in walls that have stood for longer than anyone admits. This is not conspiracy. This is urban planning. This is economic development. This is progress. And that is precisely what makes it so effective as a form of suppression. Because it does not require coordination or secret meetings or shadowy figures making decisions in smoke-filled rooms. It simply requires that we continue to value the new over the old, the efficient over the beautiful, the profitable over the mysterious. But the physical destruction of buildings is only the most visible form of ongoing erasure, because there is another dimension to this suppression that operates in the realm of information itself, in the digital spaces where more and more of human knowledge now resides. If you have ever tried to research these topics online, you have likely noticed something peculiar, something that becomes more pronounced with each passing year. Search engines that once returned diverse results now seem to funnel you toward the same approved sources, the same dismissive Wikipedia articles, the same academic papers that acknowledge the existence of old maps labeled Tartaria, only to explain them away as European ignorance of Asian geography. Social media platforms have implemented policies specifically targeting what they call conspiracy content. And while these policies are framed as protecting users from harmful misinformation, the practical effect is that certain questions become harder to ask, certain connections become harder to share. Certain communities of researchers find their reach throttled and their accounts suspended for violations they do not understand. The algorithms that determine what information rises to visibility and what information sinks into obscurity are not neutral. They are designed by people who hold certain assumptions about what constitutes legitimate inquiry. And those assumptions do not include the possibility that mainstream history has been deliberately falsified, or that evidence of advanced ancient civilizations has been systematically suppressed. This is not to say that every piece of content labeled as conspiracy is valuable or true. Much of it is not. But the broad application of these labels creates a chilling effect that extends far beyond the genuinely harmful content these policies claim to target. When you are trained to associate certain questions with foolishness or danger, you stop asking those questions. You stop even thinking them, and that is the most insidious form of suppression of all, the kind that operates not through external force, but through internalized limitation. We are conditioned from childhood to trust certain sources and distrust others, to believe that academia has our best interests at heart, to assume that if something important were being hidden, surely someone would have exposed it by now. We are taught the word conspiracy theory as if it were a diagnosis. A label that once applied to an idea renders that idea unworthy of serious consideration, and we apply this label to others, and we accept it when others apply it to us, without ever stopping to ask who benefits from this particular form of intellectual gatekeeping. The term itself has a history. It was popularized by intelligence agencies in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, specifically to discredit those who questioned the official narrative. And it has served that purpose admirably ever since, not by proving that any particular theory is false, but by making the mere act of theorizing about conspiracies a mark of intellectual deficiency. Think about that for a moment. We live in a world where powerful institutions have repeatedly been caught lying, where official narratives have repeatedly been exposed as fabrications, where the phrase conspiracy theory has been applied to claims that later proved true, and yet we continue to use this phrase as if it settled something, as if calling an idea a conspiracy theory were equivalent to refuting it. This is not rational behavior. This is conditioned behavior, and it serves the interests of those who benefit from the continuity of official narratives, regardless of their truth. So when we trace the timeline of suppression, we see not a single event, but a continuous process that has adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential function. First, there was the catastrophe itself. Whatever combination of natural disaster and deliberate destruction ended Tartaria as a functioning civilization. Then there was a period of active erasure, the destruction of records, the rewriting of maps, the orphaned trains that redistributed children who remembered too much to families who would teach them to forget, the construction of a new historical narrative that began precisely at the point where the old one had been severed. Then there was a period of institutional forgetting, as the generation that knew what had happened died off and was replaced by generations who only knew what they had been taught, as the institutions of academia and government and media solidified around narratives that excluded any trace of Tartaria or the Anunnaki, or the true antiquity of human civilization. And now we are in a period of maintenance, where the forgetting has become so complete that active suppression is rarely necessary, where the mere structure of our information systems and educational institutions and social expectations ensures that certain questions are never asked, and certain connections are never made, and certain evidence is never examined with the seriousness it deserves. And here is the difficult truth that we must confront, the truth that implicates us all. We have participated in this forgetting, not because we are foolish or complicit, but because we were born into a world where the forgetting had already occurred, where the narratives were already in place, where the questions we might have asked had already been rendered unaskable by the weight of institutional consensus. Every time we dismissed a strange building as merely old-fashioned, every time we accepted the official date on a historical plaque without questioning how peasants with hand tools could have created what we were seeing, every time we laughed at someone who suggested that our history might not be what we were taught, we participated in the maintenance of a forgetting that began before we were born. This is not an accusation. This is a recognition, because we cannot change what we did not know, but we can change what we do now that we know. And that is why this suppression, however thorough, can never be complete, because the evidence is still there, waiting to be seen by those who have learned how to look. They can demolish buildings, they can suppress information, but they cannot make you unsee what you have seen. And once you know what to look for, the evidence is everywhere. So let us talk about how to see, how to walk through your own city with eyes that have been opened by everything we have discussed, how to recognize the fingerprints of Tartaria and the Anunnaki in the structures that surround you. The first thing to look for is buried floors, those windows and doors at ground level that clearly were not designed to be at ground level. Those entrances that require you to descend steps to reach what should have been the main floor, those buildings that seem to sink into the earth as if they were slowly being swallowed. You will find these in every old city, and once you start noticing them, you will wonder how you ever missed them, how you walked past these anomalies 1,000 times without registering what they meant. Official explanations exist, of course. Stories about accumulated debris and rising street levels and deliberate infill for various practical purposes. And some of these explanations may even be true in some cases. But when you see the same pattern repeated across continents, across cities that have no shared history according to the official narrative, across buildings of wildly different supposed ages and purposes, you begin to suspect that you are looking at evidence of something systematic, something that affected the entire world within a relatively narrow window of time. The second thing to look for is scale, the oversized doorways and uncommonly high ceilings, and windows that seem designed for beings taller than modern humans. Again, official explanations exist. Stories about grand aspirations and status displays, and the practical advantages of high ceilings for ventilation. But when you stand before a door that is 12 feet tall and ask yourself who was supposed to walk through it, when you look up at windows that begin 8 feet above the floor and ask yourself who was supposed to look out of them, the official explanations begin to feel insufficient. These buildings were designed for someone, and the more you examine them, the less certain you become that that someone looked like us. The third thing to look for is detail at heights where no human eye would naturally look. Ornate work on cornices and rooftops and the upper reaches of facades. Work that would have required enormous effort and expense. A work that serves no practical purpose and offers no benefit to anyone standing at street level. Why would builders go to such trouble for decorations that no one would see, unless someone would see them, unless these buildings were designed for beings who move differently than we do, who viewed them from different angles, who appreciated details that remain invisible to those of us bound to the ground? The fourth thing to look for is removed elements. The scars on buildings where something used to be, the strange fittings and brackets and openings that no longer connect to anything. The architectural features that appear in old photographs, but have since been stripped away during renovations that were never adequately explained. Many Tartarian buildings originally featured antenna-like structures on their roofs, spires and finials, and elaborate metalwork that served no obvious decorative purpose. And most of these elements have been systematically removed over the past century, cut away and melted down and erased from the buildings they once crowned. If these elements were merely decorative, why go to the trouble and expense of removing them? But if they were functional, if they were part of a system we no longer understand, then their removal begins to make a different kind of sense. The fifth thing to look for is uniformity across distance, the strange similarity of certain building styles across cities and countries and continents that supposedly had no contact with each other during the periods when these buildings were supposedly constructed. When you see the same distinctive architectural vocabulary in St. Petersburg and San Francisco, in Melbourne and Montreal, in Buenos Aires and Birmingham, you face a choice between two explanations. Either there was a global architectural movement so powerful and so coordinated that it produced nearly identical buildings on every inhabited continent within a span of decades, a movement that somehow left minimal traces in the historical record and operated without modern communication technology. All these buildings share a common source that predates the official timeline, a source that the official narrative has been constructed to conceal. When you walk through your city with these 5 markers in mind, you will begin to see things you never saw before. You will notice buildings that seem to belong to a different world. Buildings that radiate a presence and a gravity that modern structures cannot match. Buildings that seem to be waiting for something, holding space for a purpose that has been forgotten. This experience, the experience of suddenly seeing what was always there but hidden in plain sight, is strange and disorienting. There is excitement in it, the thrill of discovery, the satisfaction of patterns clicking into place, the sense that you are finally perceiving something real after a lifetime of looking at shadows. But there is also grief, because every anomalous building you notice is evidence of something that was lost. Every buried floor is a monument to a catastrophe that was never acknowledged. Every removed ornament is a scar from a wound that was never allowed to heal. You will find yourself standing before some old courthouse or railway station, looking up at its impossible grandeur. And you will feel something you cannot quite name, something that is partly wonder and partly sorrow and partly a strange recognition, as if some part of you remembers what this building was for, what the world was like when it was built, what we lost when that world ended. Do not dismiss this feeling. It is not imagination. It is not wishful thinking. It is something deeper, something that connects you to a history that you were never taught but that you carry in your blood. There are resources available for those who want to go deeper. Archives of old maps that show Tartaria clearly labelled, collections of historical photographs that show cities empty of people, and buildings that were supposedly under construction but appear already complete, and repositories of newspaper clippings from the 19th century that describe discoveries and events that contradict everything we think we know about that era. These resources exist despite the suppression, despite the algorithms, despite the institutional gatekeeping, because truth has a way of persisting even when powerful forces want it gone. Seek these resources out, compare what you find to the buildings in your own city, and draw your own conclusions. But exercise healthy skepticism as well, because not everything old is Tartarian. Not every anomaly is evidence. Not every unexplained feature points to a lost civilization. Some buildings are just old. Some buried floors are just the result of accumulated debris. Some tall doorways are just the result of architectural fashion. The goal is not to see Tartaria everywhere, but to see it where it actually exists, to distinguish genuine evidence from mere coincidence, to build a picture that is grounded in observation rather than wishful thinking. And perhaps that is the most important thing we can take from this story. Not answers, but awareness. Not conclusions, but questions. Not certainty, but the willingness to look at familiar things with unfamiliar eyes and ask whether what we have been told is actually true. Because the deepest meaning of everything we have explored lies not in the historical details, but in what those details imply about our nature and our place in the cosmos. If Tartaria was real, if it was the last functioning colony of the Anunnaki, if it preserved knowledge and technology inherited from beings who came from elsewhere, and then its destruction represents something far more significant than the mere loss of a civilization. It represents the orphaning of humanity, the severing of our connection to our cosmic origins, the deliberate closing of a door that once stood open between us and the stars. Think about what this would mean. Think about the human longing for transcendence, the persistent sense that there must be something more than this mundane world of work and worry and death, the dreams of flight and the myths of gods, and the architecture that reaches toward the sky as if straining to remember something just beyond the edge of memory. What if these are not merely psychological quirks or evolutionary accidents? What if they are echoes of a heritage that was stolen from us? Genetic memories of a time when we knew what we were and where we came from and what we were capable of becoming? What if the vague dissatisfaction that haunts modern life, the sense that something essential is missing even when all material needs are met, is not a personal failing or a chemical imbalance, but an accurate perception of actual loss? The wound left by a severing that occurred before our great-grandparents were born, but that we still carry in our cells. This is not a comfortable idea. It is easier to believe that we are what we have always been, that our history is what we were taught, that the world makes sense in the way we were told it makes sense. But ease and truth are not the same thing. And sometimes the most difficult ideas are also the most important ones. If there is any hope in this story, it lies in the possibility that the connection was never completely severed, that something remains, that the Anunnaki heritage persists in our blood and our bones, and our inexplicable yearning for something more. If awareness is a form of reconnection, then simply knowing what was lost begins to repair the loss. If attention is a form of remembrance, then looking at these old buildings with new eyes begins to restore what was taken. This is not mysticism. This is recognition that consciousness matters, that what we know shapes what we are, that the systematic forgetting of our true history has been a form of ongoing violence against human potential. The responsibility that comes with this knowledge is not to evangelize or to convince others or to join some movement or to do anything dramatic at all. The responsibility is simply to see, to remember, to hold space for the possibility that our story is stranger and grander and sadder than we were taught. The responsibility is to not participate in the forgetting anymore, to not dismiss these questions reflexively, to not apply the label of conspiracy theory to ideas simply because they challenge comfortable assumptions. The responsibility is to preserve what remains, whether that means supporting the preservation of old buildings, or seeking out suppressed information, or simply passing on what you have learned to others who are ready to hear it. We do not have all the answers. After everything we have explored, we are left with more questions than we started with, and that is as it should be. The goal was never to replace one certainty with another, but to open space for inquiry that has been systematically closed, to suggest that the map we were given does not match the territory, to point at evidence that deserves attention even if we cannot fully explain what it means. The goal was to change how you see, and if you have come this far, that goal has been achieved. Imagine yourself now standing in an old city at night, the kind of city where buildings from another era still stand alongside modern structures, where the streetlights cast shadows on facades that have witnessed more than a century of human life, where the silence of the late hour makes it possible to hear something that is drowned out by the noise of the day. You have been in places like this before. You have walked these streets without seeing. You have looked at these buildings without understanding, but now everything is different. Now you see the buried first floors, the oversized doorways, the details at impossible heights, the scars where ornaments used to be, and you understand that you are not looking at the work of 19th century craftsmen using 19th century technology. You are looking at something older, something stranger, something that connects back through time to the very beginning of human civilization, to the tablets of Sumer, to the stories of gods who came from elsewhere and built wonders and taught humanity, and then departed, leaving behind a colony that persisted for millennia until it too was destroyed and forgotten. These buildings are witnesses. They are monuments. They are messages from a past that was supposed to be erased, but that persists in stone and brick and metal, waiting for someone to read what they have to say. And you are reading them now. You are seeing them now. And that seeing is itself an act of resistance against the forgetting, a small but real repair of a wound that has never healed. There is grief in this. Yes, grief for what was lost, grief for the connection that was severed, grief for the golden age that ended in mud and fire and silence. But there is also something else, something that might be called hope, or might be called wonder, or might simply be called awakening, because you know now, you see now, and that knowing and seeing changes everything, not through dramatic action, but through the quiet revolution of a mind that has been opened and can never be fully closed again. So the next time you walk past an old building, the kind they do not build anymore, the kind they are slowly tearing down, take a moment, look at it, really look. Ask yourself how it was built. Ask yourself what it was for. Ask yourself what happened to the people who built it. And if you feel something strange, a recognition, a loss, a longing for something you never knew, you are not imagining it. You are remembering.